Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, does it concern you that candidates for Congress spent $450 million running for office last year?
Not particularly, because that meant an awful lot of people participated by contributing to them. As a matter of fact, we didn't spend very much on politics at all. American consumers spent about $230 billion on bottled water last year. And of course on commercials and communications for private products, the cost goes far beyond anything spent on politics. The important thing to remember about campaign spending is that it represents voter participation. And what's really dramatically improved, in my judgment, over the last 4 or 5 years is the number of people participating by giving. Under our current laws, it's not possible for somebody to give a whole lot. You've got to have a broad base in order to raise a reasonable amount of money, because there's a rather severe limit on what an individual can contribute to a political candidate. So I don't think it's bad. I think it's good.
You talk about the number of individuals being
Yes.
able to contribute. The Congressional Quarterly, in their issue on campaign funding, reported that about 20% of the money to senatorial candidates and about a third of the money to House candidates came from political action committees.
Yes.
Does that concern you?
It does concern me a little bit, and Senator Packwood from Oregon and I have offered an alternative bill on campaign finance that would eliminate PAC contributions both to candidates, and we've said we would be willing to extend that to parties as well. If there is any problem in the current system, it's the perception of undue influence or special interest influence. I think probably it's only a perceptual problem, but if it's a perception of a problem, I think we should let that go. What we should not have is a limit on participation of individuals. And that's the danger of the measure S2, which is before the Senate, which puts a cap on spending, and that thereby puts a cap on participation, and provides a large portion of that spending that is allowed comes out of the Treasury, out of the government Treasury. And the last thing we need to do, having doubled the national debt in the last 5 years, is to dip into the Treasury for an entitlement program for political campaigns for people seeking congressional seats.
You know, what you've just described is a bill that's been proposed by Senator Boren,
Right.
I believe, and then you mentioned you have a substitute. Explain how yours is different from that.
Well, under the McConnell-Packwood bill, we encourage participation. We don't discourage it. We eliminate PAC contribution, Political Action Committee contributions, and simply rely on the individual private contribution system. After all, you know, how much you're able to spend depends upon how much you're able to raise. And since you can only raise it in small denominations under our federal law, that means you're getting it from a whole lot of people. So I think that kind of increased participation is the kind of thing we ought to be encouraging. And that's what the McConnell-Packwood alternative does.
I'd like to welcome you to this evening's programming. For about the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be discussing campaign financing, which has been discussed on the floor of the U.S. Senate the last few days. Our guest is Senator Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky. I invite you to call. We'll start taking the phone calls in a few minutes. You'll see the numbers across the bottom of your screen throughout the evening. In the Eastern or Central time zone, it's 202-628-2525. Out west and in the Mountain time zone, 202-783-2727. In the Congressional Quarterly issue on campaign financing, an article said almost every conceivable change in the law benefits or harms one party or the other. Is that true, and is that what makes this a partisan issue?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the Democrats feel that it's important to their continued success to put a limit on participation, and that's why they're very much in favor of capping spending. The Supreme Court said that in order to cap spending, you have to provide some optional funding method from taxpayers' money. And so they've come up with this scheme which purports to limit spending and dip into the Treasury, because they know that that will then shift the influence to groups like organized labor and others that tend to be democratic and with which they have done rather well. In one of the ironies of modern American politics, it's been the Republicans and not the Democrats who have prospered under the post-Watergate reform legislation, which is kind of interesting. And the post-Watergate reform legislation essentially was this, that there ought to be limits on what people can contribute, and it was put rather low, $1,000 in the primary and $1,000 in the general election. That hadn't been raised in 12 years. A limit on what individuals can give, and full disclosure, so that if I get a contribution from someone who is an unsavory character, it's on my report, and my opponent is free to make an issue of it. In fact, Senator Lowell Weicker, who was a member of the Watergate Committee, pointed out yesterday in debate on the Senate floor that the Watergate Committee specifically recommended against specifically recommended against public funding and spending limits. And so I think that's an interesting indication of what the committee that looked at the biggest government corruption possibly in our history thought about the notion of public funding and spending limits for congressional races.
For our viewers who may not have access to C-SPAN 2 to be able to see what's been happening on the Senate, could you explain for us how this bill has evolved and what the status of the situation is now?
Well, it's rather interesting. The Senate, some would argue, has been engaged in extensive debate, and I have been leading that extensive debate in opposition to public-funded Senate races and spending limits in Senate races. The Majority Leader filed what we call a cloture petition, that is to cut off debate. It takes 60 votes to cut off debate, and that vote on Tuesday fell 8 votes short. There will be additional cloture votes filed by him occurring on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, and unless the proponents of S2 are able to get 60 votes, my judgment is the bill will be taken down by the Majority Leader. I told a New York Times reporter earlier this afternoon that if S2 was not dead, it was at least comatose, and I think I can safely predict at this point that the taxpayers will not be saddled with the burden of involuntarily having to finance the political campaigns of candidates out of the federal treasury.
With the sides split as they are, a lot of the stories on this issue, everybody from both sides, they all talk about compromise. Is there a chance to compromise these two positions?
Well, Senator Boren came forward today with what he called a compromise, which still involved public funding and spending limits. And as long as the Democrats insist on dipping into the Treasury for campaigns, and as long as they insist on capping participation, by capping what one is able to spend, in other words, what he's able to get support from others, then I don't think there'll be a compromise.
Before we take our first call in just a moment, we're going to look at a clip from a call-in show that we did Wednesday morning and get the Senator's reaction. Our guest was Jacqueline Combs, who's a reporter for the Congressional Quarterly, and she was talking about how both parties use the campaign reform bill to their advantage, and we'll see what she has to say.
Neither side, Democrat or Republican, is exactly totally selfless in this issue. The Democrats, Bob Byrd, they like to go on TV on the Senate floor and say that we're for campaign finance reform and limit PACs. And Republicans say, okay, do away with PACs altogether, but what they're not telling you is that PAC money would continue to go to party organizations and from them be funneled to the candidates.
So neither, in this case, neither side's telling you the complete story?
Exactly.
Neither side telling the complete story. Do you think you have told the complete story?
She's not quite correct. Packwood and I both said on the floor we'd be happy to ban PAC contributions to parties as well. We'd be happy to eliminate PAC contributions altogether. S2, interestingly enough, doesn't do anything about PAC contributions. They're still allowed to give up to 30% of that portion that you're still able to spend under the spending limit. So you're still able to raise some private money under S2, and of that private money, 30% of it can come from political action committees. We would have been more than happy to take them out of the process altogether. So that's the truth of the matter.
We'll find out now what our viewers have to say about this. We're going to go to the phones now. We invite you to call the East Coast lines. There's one available. The West Coast lines are still open. See the numbers across the bottom of your screen, and we'll take our first call this afternoon for Senator McConnell of Kentucky from Honolulu. Good afternoon.
Hi. I just wanted to thank the Senator for sticking up for me. But not that I agree with everything.
Honolulu, turn the volume down on your television set. We're getting just a little bit of feedback, and it's difficult to understand. Are you still there, Honolulu? We must have lost Honolulu on that. We'll try to get her back in just a little bit. In your bill, you talk about banning political action committee money from candidates, but not from parties. What's the...
Well, but I said we'd be happy to broaden it to include parties, and I offered that to Senator Boren on the floor. The truth of the matter is the Democrats don't want to ban political action committee contributions because they do better with PACs than the Republicans do. And if there is any portion of the current funding of campaigns that is special interest, it's the PAC contribution. I get letters all the time from my constituents saying, Senator, do something about the PACs, support S2. S2 doesn't do anything about the PACs. Only McConnell Packwood would do something about the PAC. So there's a good deal. What's happened here was a bait and switch. The Boren bill last year lowered PAC contributions from $5,000 to $3,000. That was a PAC bill. The Boren bill this year doesn't do anything about PACs. It's a public funding, a taxpayer, Treasury funding, and limitation on participation bill. And so that's, people are reacting to last year's Boren bill.
Our next call for the senator from Palm Harbor, Florida. Good afternoon.
Yeah, Senator McConnell, I'm a retired letter carrier, and I belong to the National Association of Letter Carriers, one of the biggest PAC contributors in the country. Is that right? And we've contributed to people like Senator Kennedy and Tip O'Neill, and they didn't do me any good because they voted for the Graham-Rudman bill, which took away my COLA in 1985. So what good is this contribution doing for me? And another thing I'd like to say, that you fellas have been perpetuating yourself in office. A young fella called up Brian on a program, and he said he walks into the voting booth, there's two buttons, one Republican, one Democrat, and he says they both stink, and I'm quitting voting. I'd like to hear your answer.
Well, with regard to your particular political action committee, Senator Kennedy must not appreciate it too much because he's supporting S2, which would provide for public funding for elections. With regard to your own interest in participating in elections, one of the things that I'm proudest of in America is that we have the right not to vote. In the Soviet Union, 99% of the people turn out to vote, but it doesn't make any difference because they don't have a real choice. In America, our citizens have three choices. They can vote for the Republican, they can vote for the Democrat, or they can stay home. And I think that people have every right to drop out of the process if they want to. I hope they won't do that. I think the business of picking public officials is an important thing because certainly we are voting every day on things that affect America. But our people have the option not to participate. That's their choice.
Do you hear that from your constituents? Does the cost, and they hear these stories about how much it costs, does that turn them off from going to
I don't think
vote?
so. There's no evidence whatsoever that that campaign spending has anything to do with turnout, and certainly no indication, no plausible, credible evidence that there's any connection between public funding and turnout. Just one quick observation about that. We've had public funding and spending limits in presidential races since 1976. Turnout dropped from 68 to 72, two privately funded races. Turnout dropped from 72 to 76, the first publicly funded race. It dropped from 76 to 80. It dropped from 80 to 84. Clearly, there's no correlation between the taxpayers paying for campaigns and putting a limit on and turnout. People choose not to turn out for a variety of different reasons. They may not like either of the candidates. They may think it's, as the gentleman who just called in from Florida said, they may think it's increasingly futile to participate. But I don't think there's any correlation whatsoever between the amount of money spent in a campaign and turnout.
Salinas, California, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to call and tell the senator that I completely agree with him on the campaign funding, and I wanted to know why they haven't stressed the fact that for every $4 checkoff, then $4 is not put into the general fund, and that this is going to raise our taxes in the final outcome of this, and why there hasn't been any media coverage on the campaign funding.
Well, your point is well made. Even though it's a voluntary checkoff, and by the way, the Senate races under S2 would be funded the same way presidential races are, and that is you check the checkoff on your tax return. Now, that doesn't add that dollar to your tax bill, but it does divert $1 of the taxes you paid away from some other government program to the political kitty, if you will. So there's no question that this money is going to come out of another government program in order to fund our races for office. It seems to me the last thing the federal government ought to be doing is funding our political races. That ought to come from you, the people of this country, on a voluntary basis. The funding from under S2 comes from you, the taxpayer, but you don't have any say-so over it. The funding under the current system, you have the choice not to contribute. And I think you ought to have that choice. Either contribute to us if you like us, or don't if you don't. And you've got that option under the current system.
Tampa, Florida, good afternoon.
Yes, I was calling in regards to this political funding. I have been watching the debate on the Senate floor, and actually I'm speaking for quite a group of us down here, we are very, very angry at this point that anybody would suggest that we as independent registered voters should be forced to pay taxes to support Republicans and Democrats. The reason we're independent is because we don't choose to choose a party. We choose to choose a person. And I think this is really represents taxation without representation. And I'm afraid that it's going to be quite a backlash on the Senate itself or Congress as a whole, because it just isn't right to impose this on the taxpayer. Nobody holds our hands while we go out to get a job. There's nobody funding us. And I just get very angry at Senator Byrd's statements that this is going to bring more people into the political action, because it isn't. It's turning people off. And when they get turned off, they're going to stop.
Ma'am, I've got to say I couldn't agree with you more. You said it very articulately, you said it very well, and that is the point. Whether we're going to call upon the taxpayers in an involuntary way to fund our political races, or whether we're going to continue to have to appeal to people to contribute to us. After all, what's wrong with that? Senator Domenici, my friend from New Mexico, a rather small state, said on the floor of the Senate the other day that he had 20,000 small contributors. What's wrong with that? That's good. That's an indication of widespread support. That's the kind of thing we ought to be encouraging. What S2 does is take the individual contributor out of the process and dip into the Treasury to fund political races. That is the very last thing we ought to be doing, and I think your observation, ma'am, was right on the mark.
I'd like to remind our viewers who are watching this program live that coming up in about 30 minutes, it'll be another live viewer call-in program focusing on the elections today in Britain, including some live broadcasts from the BBC. That's coming up at about 7:15 Eastern Time. But right now we have about a half hour left in our discussion of campaign financing. Our next call from Phoenix, Arizona. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. What I was interested in is if we can have the House of Representatives same way as the Senate, only on a 4-year term, and half of them voted for 2 years, half go for 4 years, and the next half go for 4 years. It's just like the Senate. So half of them will always be a continuing body in the House of Representatives. And then also I'd like to see people just have 10 years, 4 years in the House and 6 years in the Senate, and that's it. Because then you can have continuing bodies. The Constitution wanted the Senate as a continuing body. But these people are in here for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elections, 30, 40, 50 years. That's not, I mean, that doesn't give the American people a chance to get new faces, and these people that come out of there get a chance to become part of the American citizenry.
Phoenix, let me ask you, do you have a specific question about the campaign financing aspect of politics?
Yes, I would like to, if they had something like that, I would like to just throw it wide open and let them have the campaigning as much as they want to.
Well,
Thanks, Phoenix.
Just a brief observation about that. As you know, that was much debated at the Constitutional Convention 200 years ago. And I think the feeling was that at least one body of the Congress ought to be responsive and responsible to the people every 2 years, and that was the notion behind the 2-year term for the House. There is some thought about a 4-year term, but it would take a constitutional amendment to bring that about.
Do any of the bills that are up now, yours or the one from Senator Bourne, specifically address the situation of a particularly wealthy candidate?
I wish we could do that, do something about that. That's the so-called millionaire's loophole created by the Supreme Court decision in 1974, which said that it was constitutional and appropriate for me to be limited in what I can give to you to 1,000 in the primary and 1,000 in the general. But it was an unconstitutional interference with my right of free speech to tell me how much I can spend on my own behalf. That's the so-called millionaire's loophole. S2 doesn't do anything about that. McConnell-Packwood doesn't do anything about that. It cannot be cured without a constitutional amendment. We do, however, in our bill, seek to level the playing field a little bit by requiring that if one is going to spend $250,000 or more, and we've had a number of people do this, in their own behalf, they have to notify the Federal Election Commission at the time they qualify for the primary. And once they notify, then their opponent is allowed to get up to $10,000 per person to help counter that, as opposed to being stuck to the $1,000 primary and $1,000 general election limit. That would level the playing field a little bit. I wish we could solve the millionaire loophole problem, but I want to repeat that most spending in American politics is not by millionaires in their own behalf. The overwhelming majority of the money, probably 95% of it, comes from small donors out across America who are voluntarily making the decision to give to the candidate of their choice, such as Senator Domenici's 20,000 small contributors.
Yonkers, New York, good afternoon.
Yes, I'd like to ask the Senate. First of all, I want to tell the Senator I agree with what he's talking about. They shouldn't be funded. But I could understand where the people are coming from, because they're afraid that people will make contributions and then look for favors. But I think that our elected officials should have the integrity, or they shouldn't be in politics, not to accept these funds, or if they do accept them, not to give these people special favors. And I don't know whether you agree with me or not on that, Senator, but I don't think the people should fund it. I think the woman I called a couple of calls ago regarding independent voters and all, and I think also another problem would be that minor parties, which could be radical parties either from the left or right, would be getting funds from the citizens.
Your point is well made. The question of undue influence on a candidate, one of the beauties of the post-Watergate legislation under which we currently operate and run is that there is a limit on what an individual or a political action committee can contribute. And so the reason those limits were put on is to deal with the very problem that you described, which used to be a serious problem. Before the Watergate, post-Watergate legislation, a person could give hundreds of thousands of dollars to one candidate. Now, obviously, if that occurs, the presumption would arise that the person giving $200,000, for example, to President Nixon or to a Senate candidate or whoever is going to have a heck of a lot of influence with them. And so the notion was that you would put a clamp on put a limit on what you could contribute. So under the post-Watergate legislation, it's not possible for anybody to give me as a candidate more than $1,000 in the primary and $1,000 in the general election. I believe that deals with the problem of undue influence that you described. That's why we put limits in the law. The other observation you made is a very sound one, and that is that under S2, the public financing bill, the taxpayer financing bill, it would be possible for a third party or fourth party or fifth party candidate in the general election, in addition to the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate, to get his hand in the till. Because by raising the same threshold amount of private money, which is not very much, then the independent candidate would also, on a dollar-for-dollar basis, potentially get up to half of the entitlement out of the Treasury that the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate would get in the general election. Now, I'm telling you what's going to happen here, ladies and gentlemen, is that every fellow who ever, and this is not just men, but using men as an example, every fellow who ever got up in the morning and looked into the mirror and said, by golly, I think I see a United States Senator in there, will be able to go out and, for raising a very small amount of private money, get a check from the Treasury out of your pockets to go out and seek public office. Running for public office is going to become the national pastime. It's going to supplant baseball.
Santa Barbara, California, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for turning me on. Regarding the campaign for election, you have to assume first that we want people to vote. Well, I think the past history shows that we really don't want the people to vote. And we have done everything within our power to keep people from voting. Let me explain for just a minute. First, you had to be 21, so we set an age limit. And then we said, well, if you're a woman, you couldn't vote. And then we went along, we said, well, then you have to live in a certain house for a certain amount of time. That cut off a lot of people that maybe were economically deprived to own property. Then we say, well, in order to vote, you got to vote on Tuesdays, from 8 to 5 or 8 to 6, whatever it is. And then we even said, in some states, in order to vote, you had to pay a poll tax. We have done, in my opinion, we have done everything in this country to keep people from voting, not to vote. The senator himself just said a minute ago that people shouldn't, if they don't want to vote, they shouldn't have to vote. That's the problem. I have to pay income tax. It's not my choice. I have to pay property tax. It's not my choice. I think people should be forced to vote. actually forced or penalized to vote. Not that you have to go to the polls and vote for somebody, but at least when you go to the polls, have a box there saying, I do not choose to vote for anybody. My point is to get people to go to vote.
Okay, Senator Barber, thank you.
Well, it's an interesting thought that you require people to vote. That is certainly done in some countries where voting is not very significant. In other words, the Soviet Union, they're required to vote, but they don't get a choice, so they go in and vote for the only candidate on the ballot. Frankly, I understand your point, but I'm somewhat troubled by the notion that we ought to require people in America to vote. We have eliminated most of the barriers that you described. We've eliminated racial barriers against voting. We've eliminated the poll tax. We gave women the right to vote in 1920, and interestingly enough, in terms of turnout, the biggest drop in turnout of eligible voters in the history of the United States was right after we gave women the right to vote. Apparently, a large number of women in those days decided not to vote, not to exercise the franchise. So I think our history, our tradition in this country is to give people the right to drop out if they want to, but to make almost everybody eligible to vote if they want to, and I think probably that's the way we ought to keep it.
We have about 20 minutes left in our discussion today with Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, about campaign financing. Senator McConnell was first elected to the Senate in 1984. Prior to that, he was Jefferson County executive for 7 years back in his home state. He was also an aide to former Senator Marlowe Cook, a Republican of Kentucky, for several years. He served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General during the Ford administration. He serves on the Agriculture and Foreign Relations Committee. He has a BA from the University of Louisville and from the University of Kentucky Law School. He's a graduate in 1967. And our next call this afternoon from Queens, New York. Good afternoon.
Yes, hello. I would just like to agree.
Queens, before you go further, turn the volume down on your TV. We're getting a little bit of feedback.
Okay.
I'd like to remind everybody when you call in to turn it down, and then that way we can hear you a lot better.
I would just like to agree with the senator from Kentucky. I think that the Democrats are just trying to find ways of, throwing their money away, and I think that the Republican way is better. It's just that the Democrats now are dominating the House and the Senate, and they get their way. It's not like, it's not like the Republicans have a choice anymore.
Well, it's really too bad that that this has become so partisan. The only way you're going to pass true election reform, and I might make the point that there are some reforms that could well be made, and if you're interested, I'll outline those. But it has to be bipartisan. We have enough votes in the Senate to keep the public funding bill from passing, and I assure you that we will do that. But there are some reforms that could be made, and if you'd like, I might
what are those that you would
describe a couple
propose?
of them. Completely outside of the cash contribution, there is the so-called in-kind contribution, what's typically referred to as soft money, where either a corporation or a labor union lends its employees who are on the payroll to engage in voter registration or get out the vote drives. It's been estimated that among labor unions alone, there are multi-million dollars of soft money contributions every year, which go completely unreported. In the McConnell-Packwood proposal, the alternative to S2, we require the reporting, so at least you'll know what's coming, what's being spent on behalf of candidates, the reporting of soft money. I might also indicate, as I did earlier, that I think political action committees, which have become rather controversial, could also be eliminated, and we do that under McConnell-Packwood. And the so-called independent expenditure, that's where somebody who has, for example, a huge amount of money decides to come into New York and run ads against a candidate. Under the Constitution, you can't keep them from doing it, but at least we could disclose the content of the commercial to the candidate in advance and disclose where the money is coming from. That's not currently disclosable. So there are some good campaign reforms that could be made. It's just that none of them are in S2.
Mesa, Arizona, good afternoon.
Yes. I'd like to start out by saying I disagree with the man from Phoenix who wanted 4-year terms for the House of Representatives. The idea of the 2-year terms was to represent the current mood of the people. And, of course, right now, with incumbents having such a decided edge in campaigns, some of them hang around till they're old enough to have to be wheeled into the House on a gurney. But on S2, I've been watching the Senate proceedings, and I find it interesting that nobody has mentioned or made any comment about lobbyists whom many Americans perceive as the real influence peddlers in the country. And I'd like to know the senator's thoughts on that.
Well, there certainly are a large core of lobbyists in this town. I might say in the defense of some of them, they do provide a pretty useful service if you know how to use a lobbyist. And by that I mean if you just simply allow them to make their argument. Many times they're a very useful part of the process, provided you use them as information sources and don't allow them to have special influence with you. So the lobbyists per se are not necessarily bad, and of course they are required to register, and that has been the law for quite some time. Since you are calling from Arizona, and since there was another caller from Arizona, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd also like to mention something that relates to your state and this debate on S2. The supporters of S2 have misrepresented the position of your much beloved former Senator Barry Goldwater. They've said that he supports S2. He told your Senator John McCain today by telephone that he does not support S2 and he does not support public funding of political races. So you folks from Arizona who've been getting ads in the newspapers out there funded by Common Cause claiming that Senator Goldwater supports S2, that's just simply not true. And you should ignore those ads and, in my judgment, consider the source.
Back across the country, Newport, Rhode Island. Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon. It's enjoyable to be with you. First, I'm enjoying the conversation with the Senator. And also some questions. I agree with his viewpoints in regards to public financing as against private financing. I do believe that the citizens of this country have supported candidates over the years and should be doing so in the future and without public financing at all. I'd also, one of the things that we have gotten from the Iran-Contra hearings has been in regards to the suspicions of the Chanel part of the affair in regards to the financing of several conservative causes in the campaign of 1986. And I was wondering if the Senator has any other information on that. And also, what bothers me more as a member of the bar for long standing and a hobbyist on the Constitution, in regards to the Contra hearings, if he could just digress a little bit, is the impression that we've gotten from the hearings, and I've watched them all on tape as the days have gone on, the notion that it seems the people in Fawn Hall, although she retracted the statement in regards to...
Newport, I tell you, we're getting a little bit off the subject, which is we're going to try to stick to campaign financing. We do a lot of other programs on the Iran-Contra, so we've got your question on what the Senator might have heard about your first question. We'll let him respond to that about what he may know about financing of campaigns from some of that money.
Yeah, the caller has obviously watched all of the hearings, and I must confess I'm not a member of that committee and I've not watched all the hearings, but my impression from reading about that portion of the hearings that related to that fundraising would lead me to believe that that fundraising was illegal under current law. And I believe the person doing the fundraising has either already pled guilty to some kind of offense under existing law. You know, there are restrictions now on the kinds of activities that, for example, the 501c3 and 4 organizations, charitable organizations, can engage in that are being abused not just by people on the right, but most of the so-called charitable organizations who are involved in political activity in this country who are, in my judgment, involved in arguable violations of their tax-free status and violations of the campaign laws happen to be groups on the left. So that is a problem. The problem that you outlined is a problem. It's a problem under existing law, and it would still be a problem under S2. It's not dealt with under S2.
Los Angeles, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I have a resentment in the way the Senator is presenting this as a cost to the government. This is totally voluntary on the part of the public. They have a choice as to whether their dollar goes for paying for the finances of a campaign. It is not out of the Treasury of the United States government. They have a choice. They check a box or they don't check a box. Also, why don't you tell the public how the religious right takes great pride in the fact that they targeted and defeated 8 senators or congressmen last year that they specifically targeted with PAC groups. Not just one PAC from a religious right, but maybe 10 different names of 10 different PAC groups. And it always amazes me how senators who could be, or congressmen who can be in government all their lives, like a good liberal senator, a man that the country adored, Jake Javits, worked for the government his entire life and started poor and ended a multi-millionaire. Always amazes me how that could happen with senators.
Okay, thanks, Los Angeles.
Okay, you covered several issues. Let's take the checkoff first. I think it's important to understand how that works. The caller is partially right. The checkoff would be voluntary. But once you make the voluntary checkoff, it isn't added to your tax bill. It simply diverts from another government program that dollar into the campaign kitty. So it most definitely does take away from another government program or add to the deficit. The money is raised voluntarily, but it's not an additional dollar on your tax return. It's a diversion of money that would otherwise go into the general fund, away from the general fund, and into the political kitty. So it takes away, for example, from women's and infants and children's programs or AIDS research or defense or whatever. It's diverted from another government purpose over into the campaign kitty. The dollar diversion is voluntary. You voluntarily shift it away from the general fund and into the campaign fund. Now, with regard to political activities of the religious right, I'm not quite sure how that is affected by this bill one way or the other.
Well, perhaps about PAC groups in general, not necessarily specifically the right.
The McConnell Packwood bill, the bill that I prefer, would eliminate PAC contributions to candidates and to parties. But you could not constitutionally say to a PAC or to an individual, you can't go into a state and make independent expenditures, that is, uncoordinated expenditures. I don't like those. And frankly, I would support a constitutional amendment to restrict those. But under the current Constitution, no law that we pass can deal with the independent expenditure problem, whether it's an expenditure made of the right or an expenditure made of the left. It's just a constitutionally protected kind of spending under our current constitutional rulings.
One of the arguments for public financing is that it would make candidates more responsive to the public. You don't think that would be the case?
No, I think it would make them less responsive to the public because they wouldn't have to go to the public for very much of their funding. And of course, the public funding bill wouldn't do anything about the independent expenditure problem that we were just discussing. All of those would still be allowed, whether the expenditures are made by people on the right or people on the left.
Our next call from Wethersfield, Connecticut. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'd like to know, I'd like to talk to the senator.
Go ahead. You're on C-SPAN.
I'm in favor of this $1,000 donation. But we had a dinner here for Vice President Bush last week, and he picked up $500,000. Did you get that?
Yeah, yes, I heard you, sir.
So, do you have a question about how that works?
They had a big dinner and cost $1,500 a plate. He got $500,000. What happened to the $1,000 donations?
I'm reasonably confident, unless he was sharing some of the proceeds with, say, the Republican Party in Connecticut, there's only the vice president or any other candidate for president can only get $1,000 per person. So my guess is that the price tag for the dinner was $1,000 a person. If it was $1,500, my guess would be that the extra $500 was for the party there or somebody else. But under the federal law that we operate under now, there's a limit of $1,000 per person to presidential candidates before the convention. The presidential campaign of the Republican and Democratic nominee from the convention on is funded by the public, taxpayers' dollars, and that's raised through the checkoff that would be expanded to provide for Senate races under S2.
Trinidad, California, good afternoon.
Hello. Thank you very much. I'd like to read you a couple of statistics I have from the San Jose Mercury News last February about the problem of PAC financing here in California. It said that in 1986, $57.1 million was spent on legislative campaigns, a 31% increase over '84.
Every incumbent who sought re-election won. Assembly incumbents outspent challengers 30 to 1. Senate incumbents outspent challengers 58 to 1. There's no question in most people's minds that money talks in election campaigns. The New York Times last December reviewed some of the problems in an editorial and came up with the statement in the end that the practical remedy is public finance for congressional elections. And it seems to me quite obvious that the present system favors the rich, who can, of course, afford to give money and have discretionary income to spend on campaign financing, whereas the poor, who are barely making it, have no money to spend for candidates who are interested in their causes and in their welfare.
Trinidad, we have just a couple of minutes left, so we'll let you go with that and let the senator respond.
Well, the lady mixed up several different issues. The wealthy, other than in their own behalf, can't contribute more than $1,000 in the primary and $1,000 in the general. It doesn't make any difference how wealthy they are. There's a limit on what they can give. As I described earlier, there is a constitutional problem with keeping a wealthy person from spending his money on his own behalf, but he can't spend it in excess of $1,000 on behalf of any other candidate. So you don't have much wealthy influence in politics these days. The real influence is with a broad range of relatively small donors. With regard to the Political Action Committee or PAC contributions that you refer to, it is the bill that I support, the McConnell-Packwood bill, that would eliminate the PAC contributions, not S2. S2, the public funding bill, would still allow in that portion of the money that you raise privately before you get the big check from the government, in that private portion, you'd still be able to get PAC contributions at $5,000 a pop, and you'd be able to get an aggregate 30% of that private money that you still get under S2 from PACs. So S2 doesn't restrict the influence of PACs at all. The McConnell-Packwood bill would.
I'd like to remind our viewers once again, for those watching live, in just a few minutes our topic is going to shift to the British elections that were held today. The polls there have just closed. We'll also be showing you some live coverage from the BBC that we're taking off the satellite. And we have time in our topic on campaign financing to take our last call today from Springfield, Ohio. Go ahead, Springfield.
Good afternoon. I'm calling to ask Senator McConnell's opinion on an amendment which was proposed a year or so ago by Senator Scott to limit congressional terms of office as one means of controlling Senate and House financing both, since it seems much easier for incumbents to raise funds and since there seems to be an inherent power there.
Thanks, Springfield.
We don't have a Senator Scott. We may have a Congressman Scott. I don't know him, but there has been some discussion about the limitation on terms. There are two schools of thought about that. One is that in most professions, the longer you're in, the more you know. And my experience in the Senate's been that you get better and better with experience, just like you do if you're making automobiles or selling insurance. And so I'm not sure it makes much sense to throw people out just as soon as they really become effective. I don't think that's necessarily going to get people better elected officials. There certainly are advantages to incumbency. I happen to have been the only Republican challenger in the entire country to defeat an incumbent in 1984. So I'm here to tell you, incumbents do have advantages. But they would have advantages under S2, just like they do under the current system. An incumbent is better known, and identity is oftentimes a big part of winning an election. And I'm not sure you cover, you can counter the incumbency advantage in any way but mandatory retirement, as you suggest. And in my view, with mandatory retirement, you're going to take an awful lot of people who know an awful lot about doing a good job arbitrarily out of the process, and I don't think that's a good idea.
Our topic this program, campaign financing. Our guest, Senator Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky. We'd like to thank him for being with us. Also thank you for your calls and comments.